Welcome back, Fashion here. So today I want to discuss new teams' first years in F1, and I want to kind of use that as a foundation to discuss uh, what expectations we should have for Cadillac going into their first season in 2026. So we're going to be looking at new teams in their first season in the last 25 years or so. I don't want to go back too far, and I'm also limiting this to teams who started brand new factories. So, for example, when Red Bull bought the Jaguar team in 2004, 2005. I'm not counting that as a new season because they basically inherited the same factory. Same with when Team Enstone switched from Benetton to Renault to Lotus and then back to Renault and then to Alpine. Right, that's not really a brand new team because it's just a team at the same factory changing their name, changing the branding. Sometimes there can be big changes, so of course with engines and stuff, but not quite the same thing as building a factory, building a team from scratch, which is exactly what Cadillac will be doing. So we're going to be doing this in chronological order. So first up is Toyota in 2002. The two drivers that year were Mika Salo and Alan McNish. An interesting driver lineup. Salo, of course, was very, very experienced. This would end up being his final year in Formula One. And for McNish, a bit of an odd choice. He made his debut quite late. I think he was in his late 20s. So it's a bit like kind of in the Nick DeVries vein of drivers making their F1 debut. And I don't think he was that bad, to be honest. The team scored 2 points that season, which, given the point system at the time, points only went down to 6 points is, somewhat impressive. They still finished 10th in the constructors that year. Out of 11 teams, the only team they beat were Arrows, who dropped out mid-season. So again, not super impressive finishing 10th out of 11, but still they did get those 2 points there. The average minimum finishing position for the team was 9.76, which is 10th. 10th out of 11, again, only better than Arrows, I believe. Or actually, no, it was only better. It was better than Minardi, but Minardi actually scored a big chunk of points in the first race of the season in Australia, of course, courtesy of Mark Webber. Now, median pole gap for Toyota that first year was 102.6%. If you translate that into the gap over a 90-second lap, that would be about roughly 2.34 seconds. So honestly, not terrible for Toyota in terms of gap to pole, although I do think the qualifying format at the time may have benefited them a little bit, as I believe this was during the one-shot qualifying era. So all in all, not a terrible first year for Toyota. We've definitely seen worse. Of course, this was a full works manufacturer team using Toyota engines, of course. And even though, again, first year wasn't terrible by the standards of what we'll see shortly after Toyota, again, they never really progressed much further. The best they ever got was, an upper midfield team. They never won a race, of course. They did get podiums here and there. And of course, they then dropped out 7 years later in 2009, despite the fact that they were spending, close to the top in terms of, the amount of money that they're spending on F1. So kind of a waste of a project, I would say. Would have been interesting to see what they could have done from 2010 onwards if, the financial crisis hadn't happened and, incentivized them to drop out of the sport. So moving on from Toyota in 2002, we have definitely one of the weaker teams on this list, and that is Super Aguri in 2006. Now, Super Aguri was basically the Honda B team at the time. Honda, of course, this was their first year as kind of a full team by themselves with their works team. Before, they'd obviously supplied engines for BAR, British American Racing, but 2006 onwards, up until basically 2008, they basically had their own team, and then they had the Super Aguri team as well, technically for all 3 of those years. And this was basically meant to be a junior team to help them develop Japanese drivers, and it was kind of the joke on the internet, to this day, is that they basically built that team just so that they could give Takuma Sato a seat, as he had a really tough time at BAR 2004, 2005. They realized they needed to upgrade their driver lineup, so they bring in Barrichello from Ferrari, but then they're like, oh, we need to put a seat, need a team for junior drivers, and they decided that they wanted to try to have an all-Japanese lineup, which, in Sato's case, he was, a below-average F1 driver, so not the worst driver in the world. But the decision to pair him up with Yuji Ide was definitely a head-scratcher. Ide barely spoke any English. His results in basically what was Formula Nippon at the time, now Super Formula, were not awful. But again, it was definitely a bit of a head-scratcher. and he came in, did I think 3 or 4 races, and he was absolutely abysmal. One of the worst qualifiers we've seen in recent F1 history. He was so bad that he had his super license revoked after 4 races. He was replaced by Frank Montagny for I think 7 races, and then they were again replaced by another Japanese driver, Sakon Yamamoto. But again, driver lineup for Super Aguri were definitely one of the weakest ones we've seen here, and I think definitely something that potentially held them back a little bit. That first season, 2006, no points, of course. This was an awful team. Finished dead last in the Constructors in 11th. Their average minimum finishing position was 15.25, which is pretty abysmal. Although what we'll see is that as reliability gets better and better as time goes on, it's easier for bad teams to have really, really bad average minimum finishing positions. But yeah, 15.25 was last by quite a big margin, quite a bit worse than Midland, who are the next worst team. In terms of median pole gap, 105.6 seconds, or 105.6%, I should say, in over a 90-second lap. That would translate to roughly a 5.04 second gap. So pretty big gap. And this was when they were qualifying on fuel load. So again, that gap would have been even bigger if they had used the qualifying format that they used now. Pretty abysmal first year. 2007 was a little bit better, and then of course 2008 they basically left the sport after 4 races. So again, a bit of a failure in terms of an F1 entry, and yeah, they never really got going as a team. So the next teams that we're going to talk about all came in 2010, and these were of course Virgin, Hispania or HRT, and then Lotus, who then had to switch their name to Caterham because there were 2 Lotus teams at the time. So the first of those teams that we're going to talk about is Virgin, of course. Their drivers for their first season, 2010, were Timo Glock and Lucas de Grassi. Honestly, not a terrible lineup, and again, this is kind of what we saw with Toyota. One really experienced driver in Timo Glock, just like Mika Salo was for Toyota, and then a rookie in Lucas de Grassi. They didn't score any points that year. These cars were absolutely abysmal. They were honestly not that much faster than Formula 2, I guess, GP2 cars at the time. And for Virgin, they finished 12th in the Constructors' Championship, dead last, despite the fact that they didn't have the worst driver lineup, and they also, I don't think, had the slowest car over qualifying pace. But for whatever reason, race results were very, very hard to come by. Average minimum finishing position for them, 17.33. Which is 12th, so dead last there. Median pole gap was a little bit better, 105.4%, so over a 90-second lap, that's 4.86 seconds, and that was a little bit better, a little bit worse, I should say, than Lotus, who were kind of the best of these 3 teams, and it was much better than Hispania, who we'll be talking about in a second. Now, the second of those teams, of course, Hispania. The one big difference between Hispania and Lotus and Virgin was the fact that Hispania had a very, very inexperienced driver lineup. They had 2 brand new rookies to start the season in Bruno Senna, Karun Chandhok, and a bit like Super Aguri before them, they basically ended up having to rotate through quite a few drivers and ended up using 4 drivers the whole season. Chandhok only does half the season. He's replaced basically for the rest of the season by some combination of Christian Klein, who's most notably raced in the mid-2000s for Jaguar and Red Bull, and then Sakon Yamamoto, who also drove for Super Aguri in 2006 and then also drove for Spiker in 2007. So pretty poor driver lineup for Hispania. I think definitely contributed to their qualifying performance being the worst out of those 3 teams. Scored no points, of course, but did finish 11th in the Constructors out of 12 teams, despite the fact that they were the slowest car in qualifying by a decent margin. Average minimum finishing position, 17.15, a little bit better than the Virgin, like I said, and a median pole gap, 107.2%. Out of, for a 90-second lap, that would translate to roughly 6.48 seconds. Now, for all 3 of these teams, this is obviously this was the first year of the kind of modern F1 qualifying format that we continue with to this day. Q1, Q2, Q3, all 3 sessions on lowest fuel load you can possibly manage, and so that does obviously make the gaps to pole look a little bit bigger, especially compared to the qualifying format that they used in the 2000s with qualifying on fuel load, or the one-shot qualifying they used as well during that time period. Now, the final of these three teams, of course, Lotus, definitely had the best driver lineup of the bunch. Heikki Kovalainen and Jarno Trulli, both race winners. So again, very reminiscent of the driver lineup that Cadillac is going with in terms of Bottas and Perez. Still, despite their driver lineup, no points, 10th in the constructors out of 12, and so they did get a little bit of prize money, and that's something that I'll talk about in a second. Average finishing position 15.67, so quite a bit better than the other two teams, but still, I think, quite a bit behind the 9th best team in F1 that year, which I believe was Toro Rosso. Median pole gap 105.1%, so 4.59 seconds off for a 90-second lap. So again, very, very close to the Virgin. Now, of course, for all three of these teams, they come into Formula One with the promise of a cost cap. And of course, we have a cost cap now. But at the time, there was a lot of pushback, especially from the big teams. And so Bernie had basically invited these three teams in to F1, promised we're going to have a cost cap, even though you guys don't have a super, viable business plan, business structure. Currently with the cost cap, you guys will be able to compete with the big teams, your Ferraris, your Red Bulls. Of course, that cost cap never comes in. They also don't change the prize money allocation, so that the allocation would go all the way down to all the teams, so 11th and 12th, but instead the prize money allocation would only go to the top 10. And again, that was definitely a Bernie, approach to things. So what ends up happening with the three new teams is they generally struggle. They never really improve, get anywhere close to the other teams. And for those first 4 years, basically 2010 to 2013, they basically are worse than everyone else. HRT Hispania only lasted 3 years. They drop out at the end of 2012. 2013, of course, they again still pretty poor. But 2014, I guess you kind of have a bit of a breakthrough here. Joe Bianchi scores the first points for any of these three teams at the 2014 Monaco Grand Prix. Marussia finishes 14th. Of course, Bianchi then, tragically, has his, what would eventually be fatal accident in Japan. The owner of Marussia drops out. Caterham also basically goes bust at the end of 2014. So that's the second of the three teams. Marussia would continue on as Marussia Manor for a couple more years. It would score points with Verline in 2016. But again, they would drop out at the end of the season for very much the similar reasons. Haas, the next team that we're about to talk about, they joined 2016. You have 11 teams again, but only the top 10 teams get prize money. So again, that really, really hurt Manor as they had finished 11th that year. So all three of these teams, not very successful runs in F1. And again, they would only last for, 5 years in Lotus Caterham's case, 3 years in Hispania's case, and then 7 years in the case of Virgin/Marussia Manor. So the last team that we want to talk about today is going to be Haas in 2016, arguably the most successful of they're still in F1, of course, and they've been in F1 longer than any other team that has managed, who've come in brand new in the last 25 years. So their driver lineup for that first season, Grosjean, Gutierrez, a little bit similar to the kind of inexperienced lineup that we've seen previously. Grosjean, of course, was a pretty well-established driver, and the rumors at the time were that he was using the seat at Haas. Of course, they were using Ferrari engines in the hope that, maybe one day he'd be able to position himself for a Ferrari seat. Obviously, that never came. Gutierrez was a bit of a head scratcher, in my opinion, given that his results in 2013 and 2014 were pretty poor, and his results in 2016 would kind of bear that out. The team scores 29 points that year, which is very, very good for a first-year team, especially given the model that Haas would end up using to build their cars. They finished 8th in the constructors that year out of 11. They benefit from the fact that there's some pretty poor teams. Renault, of course, come back for F1 after financial difficulties of Lotus. Sauber's kind of a financial disaster as well, as is Manor. So there's some really, really poor teams in F1 at this point, and Haas having a very, very strong start to the season. Really big points finishes in the first couple races of the season helps them to kind of stay afloat and stay in that 8th in the constructors spot. Their average minimum finishing position over the whole season, 10.76, which was 8th, and then median pole gap, 102.5%, or 2.25 seconds, which again, very, very reasonable, given how big those gaps can potentially be in the current qualifying format. Now, the strange thing for Haas was that, unlike most new teams, which generally start really, really poor and then get better as the season goes along, they started very, very strong and then actually got worse as the season went along. And that is, of course, because of the model that Haas have basically used for the most part to this day, which is they use as many parts as possible from Ferrari. And so they start the season with, a car that's, quite similar to the Ferrari from the year before. And then, of course, they don't make their own upgrades. Other teams improve, and they just generally fall down the order, which is something that happened in 2016, and we've seen it happen many other times over Haas's relatively short history. But still, relatively successful first season. And again, because they found a financial model that works for them in terms of the fact that it allows them to be somewhat competitive in the Constructors' Championship. Yes, they're probably never going to win a championship. They may never win a race. I think maybe with some good luck, they can maybe get a podium someday. But again, the model that they have where they're basically using a lot of parts from other teams, namely Ferrari, does kind of limit the ceiling of what they've been able to achieve in F1. But nonetheless, I think, in my opinion, probably the most successful team of the bunch. So now I want to talk about, where does Cadillac stand in all this going into their first season, 2026, based on what we've talked about with other past teams who have come into F1. So I think the first part I want to talk about is that for a new team coming in, the driver lineup that they have of Bottas and Perez is definitely much better than average compared to the ones that we've just looked at. You can argue whether it's better than Kovalainen and Trulli. I would say it's probably a little bit better. And again, I don't think that for Cadillac this season, the drivers are almost certainly not going to be the limiting factor, and they should not be, why Cadillac has any issues this year. If anything, it's almost certainly going to be on the car. So again, that's a good start for Cadillac, having a really, very strong driver lineup. They have two very experienced drivers with a point to prove after, somewhat turbulent endings to their previous time in F1, which of course was 2024. Now, of course, neither of the two drivers raced last year, so again, both of them might be a little bit rusty to start the season, but I'm sure, given the ceilings that they've shown over their careers, I'm sure they'll be able to find their groove relatively quickly. The second part is that I think, unlike 2016 when Haas came in, there are no true backmarkers, I think, at this point in F1. I think they're really going to need someone to have an absolutely disastrous season to not be last. Now, of course, someone could come in with an absolutely terrible engine. Audi could have a terrible engine, and that could, consign them to last. If Ferrari have a terrible engine, of course, Cadillac's using Ferrari engines. That definitely does not help them. And I don't think there's any way that they really end up being better than Haas, unless Haas has an absolutely terrible chassis or something. The other one I would say is the possibility of Aston Martin having a disastrous season, or even Racing Bulls. I think those would probably be the most likely teams that could potentially be worse than Cadillac. But again, all the teams at this point are in very stable financial states because of the cost cap. You don't have teams like Sauber and Manor in 2016, which were basically on the brink of basically completely falling off the grid entirely. And because of that, I think it's going to be very hard for Cadillac to not be last. Just because there are no true backmarkers, or even back in like 2002 where Toyota finished ahead of Arrows that year, and they were probably a bit quicker than the Minardi as well. So I think, speaking of cost cap, I think the cost cap is going to have an interesting effect on the grid as well. Obviously, the first year of a new set of regulations, you do see the grid generally expand in terms of gap between best car and worst car compared to where it was before those regulations. Last year, the gap between best and worst in qualifying was about 1.1 seconds, which is the smallest it's been basically ever. How big that gap gets this year is going to be a really big question. I think potentially 2 to 2.5 seconds I would expect. But again, the driver lineup's pretty good. You can argue on paper it's better than quite a few teams like Racing Bulls, for example. And so because of that, if the gaps are relatively small, some really, really strong performances from Perez or Bottas could potentially enable them to allow them to finish ahead of a team like Racing Bulls, for example, who I think most people would agree probably have the weakest lineup in 2026. Now, next point that I want to make is that, of course, I think the Ferrari engine may make or break their season. If the Ferrari engine is really, really good, it may actually save them from finishing last in the Constructors. Maybe they could finish 8th, 9th, depending on where the other teams are. But of course, if the Ferrari engine is really, really poor, then I think that's basically a guaranteed 11th place finish. So how that engine is, could really have a big effect on the perception of their season as well. And I also would expect a really big improvement in season. Unlike Haas, Cadillac seem to be going all in on making their own parts, not relying on other teams. And so, based on what we've heard from the team as well and from leadership, it seems like they brought a very basic aerodynamic package, very basic car to the first test, and that's probably what we're going to see for the first couple of races. But I would expect a very big ramp up in terms of performance as the season goes along. So I would expect them to start very, very slow and almost certainly be the last place team. But if things go really, really well with upgrades, other teams falter. Maybe they're competitive with the teams in 9th and 10th by the end of the season. So that's kind of my thoughts on where Cadillac stand going into 2026. Of course, we have the first test coming up this week. I know F1 is trying to keep that as secret as possible, but I do think that we're going to get some ideas of the pecking order after that first test. Of course, a closed door test at Barcelona. So again, we're not going to have access to times and such, but there's going to be, I'm sure, rumors and stuff will start coming out. Taking a look at past teams as well, past brand new teams to F1 and how they did, and kind of sets a a benchmark for what we can expect for Cadillac. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.